I think, to me, the first thing is we should push aside the institution in the sense that it's not about saving an institution. It's not about saving universities or saving high schoolers or schools. It's about deciding what are the principles that are important for us to move forward with. The institution being an instrument, a means to an end. And we tend to see it as the end, right? We have to save the university. But really, it's just a vehicle for what we want to do, right? So, what would be the fundamental? if you had to start all over again, how would you imagine a beautiful moment of learning for you? What would it be in 20 years, for example? You have kids, and you decide that you want to give your 13-year-old, let's say early teen, you want to give him or her a beautiful learning moment. What would it look like?
I think, like for me, it's really kind of synonymous with the. It's synonymous with like going through a journey or something like that. So like a bit like you go like on a trekking in the mountains or something. I mean it's a bit metaphorical, but at the same time it's not like if you actually go in the mountains and if your goal is to learn something that has to do with that, then that's probably like a nice way of doing it. But if your journey is to like say learn about, I don't know, Monte Carlo simulations or whatever, maybe you have to make a project or something, and so I feel that there's this kind of maybe I would personally like to apply the kind of hero's journey where you kind of journey in the unknown and kind of like go through like your own, like I don't know, story and eventually come back with some knowledge.
Actually, I think it has to be, or for me, it would have to be something experiential in some way. So either a trip or a project, but something where you're not learning theory and practice separately, but you're putting the two together from the beginning.
But that would be a beautiful moment. It's not enough, is it? Just wait. It's not enough, right? Because you can apply theory and practice and. Okay, I'm going to be facetious, and I apologize for that. But fixing the tire on your bike, you just had a flat.
Honestly, for me, that would be that.
Okay.
The first time doing it yourself. Super fun.
Why is this thing not working?
I'm just going to add on to what Viola and Christian said. I completely agree, and I think along with that, there also has to be some kind of freedom in what you learn or in how you learn. And I think one issue with kind of the way it's re-described, you learn this, you focus on those aspects. If you have the freedom to kind of go into your environment where you're learning, where it's experimental, but also focus on what you want and just look at the questions that you're interested in, I think that's also a big part of it.
Let me just ask you a question. So, do you need some sort of mastery before you get that freedom?
I think it really depends on what you want to do, and I think at that age, just in terms of a learning moment, I don't think you need mastery to learn something from it. I think if you want to later do more complex things with it, you may need a foundation, or it would be useful to have a foundation, but I think just to come up with a moment of, oh, I learned this, or that kind of aha moment, you just, it's not always necessary.
Yeah. No, I like what Christian said about like the hero's journey, and I guess it would have to start or be preceded by like the call to adventure. Like something has to call you that you want to learn, and maybe there's ways to instill that. Or
how would you see that? A call to? I like the idea. How would you see a call to adventure? It sounds inspiring more than just going to school.
Yeah. I guess you have to be given like I don't know, some breadcrumbs of like what's at the end of the road, like what I don't know, what's the significance of this like mystery that you're going to learn about?
Is becoming, for example, a first violin in an orchestra, is that a bit like that?
Becoming the first violin.
Right, becoming a great violinist, right, for example.
I guess if you're
Is that a
young and
hero?
you're,
Is that a hero's journey?
yeah, it could be.
Daniel?
I'm trying to figure out how to formulate this, but something I've been thinking about a lot is like maybe this ties in with Hero's Journey, but at the end of the day, like figuring out how to like understand what you're trying to learn from within, like constructing it from your own point of view. I guess what I mean by that is like kind of a moment of insight where you say aha, and you kind of feel implicitly with your whole body that you are now in tune in some way. You like recognize the larger pattern of what you're trying to learn, rather than just kind of internalizing what's thrown at you, but like rather like understanding it from the inside out.
But does a hero have a ha-ha moment in his journey, or her journey? Always? What kind?
Maybe.
It's just that, it's aha. There's not much you can say about it, it's sort of mysterious.
But it's always like right there. It's not like like whatever you realize is like, aha has always been very close by, wherever that is. It's never something that is alien to you. It's something that you kind of like, you're seeing the backside of, the coin in some way that you've been looking at the wrong way.
In this hero journey, is the instructor Gandalf? And like the mentor, I guess? Play the mentor role instead of like the instructor role?
What's the difference?
There's a big difference.
Okay, what is it?
Instructors are basically just teaching you things. They're throwing information at you. The mentor wants to see you succeed. Instructors necessarily may not want to see you succeed. They're just there to give you information.
To me, yeah, an instructor feels like it feeds into what exists now, which is this input of information and output of said information that sort of like systematizes knowledge. So it's not really about how you're thinking, but it is the subject of what you're thinking about that we focus on right now. And somehow stripping that away, like I think I was speaking with Nikia about how when I transitioned from sciences to arts, I think I had become very tired of being told information to tell the information back. Not to say that that's not important for how we view science, but say in some arts courses you need to take in information but then create a perspective using it, and that to me constantly provides an aha in a way that I don't necessarily feel as much in the at least lower level sciences that prioritize the subject and the mastery, which is sort of an arbitrary definition of knowledge anyway. Like, striving for mastery feels like you're striving for someone else's definition of mastery as opposed to yourself, your own.
I guess if I could like draw a line through that, so like the cognitive scientist John Vervaeke out of Toronto makes a distinction between 4 kinds of knowing. They all start with P, the 4 P's. One is kind of like propositional knowledge, which is like I think the default way we think about it, just stuff we can verify as true or false. That is kind of the subject of science and like math in a lot of ways. But he also talks about procedural knowledge, which is like knowing how to do something, like ride a bike. But then there's also perspectival knowing, which is knowing what it is like to have a certain experience, or like to take some sort of point of view. And there's also participatory knowing, which is his innovation is kind of difficult to understand, but it's kind of entering in a flow state with your environment and like being really tightly coupled with it. Like what I'm trying to say, I think, is like I think that a lot of my schooling has really dealt with like propositional knowledge and making sure that I can like produce something that is verifiably true or false to some degree, and kind of has left out like teaching me how to really know how to interact with my environment and like more implicit or older knowledge.
It's interesting you mentioned like the 4 types of knowledge, because I was talking with Leo about like you know what it is kind of like it's not the same core categories, but it's for like when like doing research in science. There's this thing. There's like there's what we know we don't know, what we don't know and what we don't know we know. And stuff like something like that, which is kind of interesting because I was saying like what is my project used for? And I was like, well, that would be like what we know we then, you know, like kind of. So it's good. Yeah. It just made me think of that.
Yeah, so good, Chris?
You were talking earlier, asking what a beautiful moment in teaching was, and I always
In
come back.
learning.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, as a student.
But that's actually an interesting question, we'll come back to that one.
Because I'm trying to look at it from both sides.
Yeah, but let's go for learning first.
There was this moment with one of my art teachers where he said, basically, my role as a teacher is to show you the path and then disappear. And I thought it was so cool because I'm like, oh yes, of course, yes. I'm doing this thing, I'm on this personal journey like others have mentioned, and this guy's just helping me figure out, you know, which direction to go, but he's not telling me everything I have to do. It's still my journey at the end of the day, so he's kind of a support there. So I really think instructors should be mentors, and that moment to me really felt satisfying because it was an aha moment, like I don't know how to describe it.
Isabel?
I kind of just walked in and missed a
I
lot of
know.
what's been going on.
By parking your polluting car?
Don't even tell me about it.
I have one too.
Touche.
That's okay, I have one too, that's not a problem.
No, but it's terrible. So I moved back to the South Shore, so I'm very far away now.
That's fine. Michael?
Yeah.
I would say that some of the most beautiful moments of learning in my life have come in periods of openness for me. Periods where I had something happened in my life, and at least for the next month or two, I tried to very actively live my life. Observing my surroundings, absorbing them, understanding how it feels very participatory in a way. And those moments can come from something that someone has told to me or from my own realizations just in thinking about how I exist in the world. But I would say also to change past moments to make them more beautiful. I would have liked to be more open in certain situations than I have been previously.
You would have liked to be yourself more open.
Well, you asked how we might change a moment of learning in our past to make it more beautiful, right? And I would say that's my answer for now, at least.
Okay.
That I think sometimes I have been closed-minded, even without realizing it.
Yeah. Okay. Rainbow?
Yeah, I really like this idea of everything being discovery, which I kind of talked about yesterday. And I think for let's say a 13-year-old, I don't know, just putting them out in an environment that's really going to be beneficial, so in nature or something, where they can really discover things on their own and give them kind of the confidence to fail and try again and have ideas and not be shut down. So I think, yeah, kind of like more self-determined learning I think is really beautiful, when it can be a journey and it can be kind of a discovery, and everything's not so fixed. There's more fluidity in it. That's what I think would be very beautiful.
In nature, it depends what kind of species you got going on there. Something. Sometimes supervised learning would be better if there's some poisonous varieties of.
No, but that's actually it's a very good point. It's actually a very good point, right? I mean, you do need supervised learning in certain things, right? I mean, you don't want to start, to your point, Elena, you don't want to start over and over again learning the basics of science, for example, right? But there's no point in trying to get, it might be, but you know, it's like language. It's like you don't want to get poisoned 25 different times, right? If you can avoid it. So yeah, supervised learning sometimes is also necessary. Gazelle, how about you?
Can I have the question again? I was broken.
A moment, a beautiful moment of learning. What would it be like 20 years from now if you had a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, and you would like, yeah, go ahead, open it up. Open it up, great, because it's a lot of noise for Jill. That microphone picks up those stupid noise
Sorry, Jill.
very well, better. Actually, it picks up these stupid noise better than voice, right? So a beautiful moment of learning would be for you. Yeah, the chip corner. Go, you're banned in the chip corner.
I was asked that.
So a beautiful moment. What would you hope would be a beautiful moment of learning for your 13-year-old?
I guess it would be discovering something that like they hadn't thought of, that it existed or would be possible, and then suddenly it like lights a fuse in them, and like they become so passionate and curious about that. I think would be that like beautiful moment of learning. Like for example, let's say that like as a kid, they learn that it's possible for us to go to space, and they're like, oh my god, and then they start learning about space. They're so excited and like they want to be an astronaut. I think that like that initial spark of finding out that is a topic that interests them and is possible for them to learn, and that's what gets them going and like gets them curious, would be that beautiful moment of learning.
How about you, Jill?
Well, I'm having trouble because I think any 13-year-old or any of us, people learn very differently. So, there's the learning styles. So it would depend on the child whether I thought that they should be in an area of an unknown thing where they go, oh my God, I didn't notice this, or whether there's something which I think it relates to propositional, Daniel, where they know something and then they see another application of it and then they go, wow, but I knew it. So the beautiful moment of learning is prefaced on having already had some learning. And that's where I get into my head. I can't figure out what it is we have to know in order to grow. And one tiny silly example was that I'm reading Kate Atkinson's new novel about the 20s in London, and she describes something as being Ozymandian. And if I didn't know Shelley's poem about Ozymandias, I would have missed so much. I burst out laughing and crying at the same time I read it. So that's where I am at the moment, Olivier, is what's the person who's 13, what do they need to have that moment? Do they need propositional, or are they a different kind of learner? That's where my thoughts are at the moment.
It's a good point, because you get extraordinarily frustrated when you have to do a task and you don't know, how to start, right? It's like, if you were to ask me a build, I don't know a table, like it's very frustrating. It's not discovery as much as frustration. You need some tools, right, Joe? If you take the idea of the journey, Christian, in an unknown, unexplored country, you need to have some knowledge of, how to find your way through stars or compass or something. If not, you're probably going to die in the woods, right? It becomes dangerous if you don't have some knowledge of the terrain, for example.
And there lies the tail then, Olivier. What is the some knowledge that you have to have for whichever journey you're taking?
Okay.
I often feel that way when like my students say that they're not like math people, because like it's the same to me. It's the same thing as like saying, oh, like I don't know how to read. I'm illiterate. We all had to learn how to read. It's not. I'm sure there's some inherent variability as to like what sticks for some people more than others, but I do think that like teaching math in a way that's useful like really helps people learn how to think systematically in a certain way, and how to know how to approach problems and notice patterns, even if they don't go into math specifically.
I feel like math to me is a perfect example of, speaking of propositional learning, I almost feel like we subsume all learning into that system nowadays, where there's no space for creating the journey within the input and the output. And so with math, you know, you do it like a recipe for most of your life.
Mhm.
And then the idea that you could create in math eventually is so lost to you.
That's true.
And so I wonder if what you need to know from the outset is more what the question is, and then get to the answer after you have a period of time to try to figure out how you could get to the answer on your own. Like I last year was in a course for my science degree where we had to come up with a research project on our own. And I remember everyone was sort of freaking out the whole way through because here we'd been for 3 years doing our science classes and never having to create or use intuition within the sciences really.
Mhm.
And it was because we never had the space to do something in the input and the output, even if the output is already known by someone. I feel you never learn how to learn it if you're already there at the other side of it, if that makes sense. If you already know what both ends of the spectrum are supposed to be.
They say that like, you know, a flow state like is achieved when like the demands of the environment like slightly exceed the skill set, but only like when there's a sufficient demand for those skills. Like when you don't need that much skill, it's boring, and if you need like if you have too much skill for some task, it's boring because it's too easy, and if you are like way out of your depth, it's just impossible to you know, even broach the subject. But when there's like a slight demand, then you really feel like you're like at the edge of your thought, and you can actually like, you know, like get to that output on your own.
Right. And so when I think of a cool learning scenario, maybe or an optimal learning scenario, say if you're learning math when you're 10, it would be if someone could ask you the question and then be there for you. If you really can't figure it out and you're just banging your head against the wall, before you learn the theory, then someone can help you.
Before you learn the theory?
Or, I don't know, I do think there's something to be said for not making everyone need to know in the exact same way.
Okay.
So like systematizing completely how to think about something. But it's hard because there's certainly a pyramid of knowledge.
Yeah, and I think to Jill's point, if you had done this to me in math, I think I would have ended up in the corner of the room crying. But if you had done this to me with language, I could have figured it out. It also depends on your strengths, right? Because some things appear more natural to you. I'm not saying you're better, just more natural to you.
Yeah.
But she does bring up a point, because as you were talking, you saw me shake my head when you said the recipe, because it's not a recipe, and that was probably what I loved about math since I was a kid, was I would always watch the teacher and think, why are you doing it the stupid way? You could do it the fun way. And like there was always a fun way where you could go in a few circles and then get to the same answer, but they never told students like there were 100 different ways to get at that result. So there is some truth to that, but then when you talked about the freaking out at doing something new in science, I think there's definitely value in that, which is, that was the hardest thing at the beginning of my PhD, is like, wait a second, I just gotta like delve into the unknown all by myself. And it was really kind of overwhelming, so there could be just something shifted, you're right, in the way that we teach across the board. So you don't have to go to an arts degree to see that you're taking this knowledge and creating it. Like there should be some more sense of creation in it.
I think
I'll say that.
And I think just adding on to like Elena, your earlier point about kind of having that space, and also what Anita said, I think part of that space isn't just space to come up with your own ideas and try things from perspectives, but also space for failure, which I think is really something. I think a lot of the fear that people, or a big part of the fear that people get when they're asked to, okay, just come up with this, or let's just figure this out, like you were saying, do it in different ways. I get even in courses now, there's do it in a different, or come up with your own thing, but make sure it works, or make sure you're gonna get some kind of results. And I feel like there isn't any space for failure right now. Like even in like, you do it another way, sure, as long as it works. And I think that's very much kind of ingrained. Where even in like research and stuff is, no one publishes failures, no one kind of shows what doesn't work. And I think that's something that really is missing, is creating, because you're never going to be able to look at things in a different way, or find new ways of doing things without encountering failure, I don't think. And I think that's also a big part of learning too, so.
Yeah. I think my high school experience like fits very well into this, because I did International Baccalaureate, and as part of that program, but I also did the national curriculum because the Minister of Education was weird about that. But the main thing was that you learn a bunch of things and you also have exams, but you also have to write a paper. Usually it was just like one paper. But for each class, it differed the kind of paper you had to write. For math, for example, I took math standard level. There's also higher level. And it was that you need to come up with a creative way of applying whatever like unit that you had in class, applying that to that kind of thinking. So there was like a lot of, I think, I can't actually remember the examples of the others, but mine was I really liked integrals. Like I hated math for a long time in my life, but I really, really liked integrals. It was fun. So I said I want to calculate the surface area and the volume of the world's largest Matryoshka doll, which was a building. It used integrals, and I was stressed because it's still a project, but I still had fun, and I still used something that
The world's largest, like you found the world's largest, and then you
the world's largest Matryoshka doll is a building in Kyrgyzstan.
that's kind of a fun.
You're right. And same with like I took environmental systems and societies, and for that you had to do an environmental research project, and everyone was just losing their minds. It was so stressful. We were like, why do we need to do this? Oh my god! And I think like that kind of resistance always happens in the classroom environments, like before university and even in university. But I like looking back, I learned so much of the skills that I used in university from my IB experience because they gave us like how do you construct a research that is reliable, that is valid, that you use all your things, and like how can you get creative with the math things that you learned, and you also had to like go one step further than what you've learned. So I had to learn how to calculate the volume, even though that was not the unit, but I was like, this is fun, I don't mind. And so all of this, I think, like, that kind of thinking is what's needed for, like, teaching math, because I hated math. I really hated math, like, it was for a long while, because they never made it fun, they never made it interesting or, like, relatable to your life, or, like, you can, I don't know, you can just, like, mess around and find out, like, how, I don't know, what's the volume of the world's largest Matryoshka doll, because why not, you know? So, yeah, I think that the input to output thing, I think with IB it was reversed, and while we were having it, we did not really realize its value, and only when I like got to university, I was like, okay, they really had a point in doing this, and I'm still very grateful for that.
So just also a word of caution, we're a self-selected group, right? So the way we would like the education system to be, of course, will be mostly common among us because we like the Building 21 thing, right? So let's keep that in mind also, right? It doesn't, I'm sure you've had students like this, David, also, and I've had students like this who want to be a bit more, want you to be a bit more directive. You probably had those, right? So let's just keep that in mind, right? What applies to us as a self-selected group might not apply to everyone. The same way that this propositional thing might not apply as well to us.
Of course.
Right, so Chris?
Just to follow up on that, I completely agree, and I have an example of one of my engineering classes where the teacher was really fun. And he would give us assignments that, you know, were out there and all sorts of crazy things. And the final exam where you're on planet Mars and you have to calculate the strain that, you know, will be used for. Anyways, it was really out there. And then when I got to my jobs, I started noticing that whatever I learned in that class was not at all applicable. Because I'm like, I'm not on planet Mars, and I'm not trying to calculate these things. So then I was like, oh, okay, so I have to, you know, think outside the box and try to branch. And anyways.
Can I think inside the box for once?
Exactly. I would have liked to have more relevant examples. But I really appreciate the class because it was fun. It was really fun. And a lot of people got, you know, engagement.
But do you think that's a valid example? Because at the time, like at the level of university, maybe like a natural curiosity has either been tramped out or they're not following it, and like they're at that point where it's like, you know what, just get me through this degree and I wanna get a job and I need to get a good grade and stop wasting my time with this nonsense about Mars. Like, I wonder if, like, I do think about that, yeah, we're a self-selected group at this, like, age and above, but what about 4 to 5-year-olds and 3 to 4-year-olds, or, like, isn't there a natural curiosity that you can find and allow people to follow?
Kids are always curious. They keep asking questions and like it's very hard to answer them sometimes.
Yeah, but there's a difference between being curious and, I think we're all curious, but how to get there, some of us, and it depends on also the discipline and what you're discovering. At some point in our life, we want people to just take us by the hand and show us. I mean,
Sure.
I've had that.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, I'm lost here. I don't feel comfortable at all moving on my own.
But you had a bit of resilience to push you in at least a discipline to want to push into the unknown. And like when you were talking about what would you want to teach your 13-year-old, for me it would be like those, like I don't think there's anything like revelatory that I've ever learned that wasn't hard. And whether it's a life experience or an academic experience, it was hard, and that's what feels good at the end. It's like, oh, okay, it makes sense now. But so I think just that resilience is a skill that, like, yeah, maybe everyone has natural curiosity, but we don't cultivate resilience.
And kind of along those lines, just in terms of us being self-selected now, but maybe earlier everyone would feel this way, is I noticed that in elementary school we would have creative projects. Most of our projects were creative when we were like 8.
Fun creative projects. From now on.
The box.
Yes.
You know, and everyone loved it, right? Anytime that you could draw or add creative stuff to your projects, everyone would do that. Then in middle school, it was still mostly like that. Whenever we were allowed to choose what to write, and it could be a story instead of an essay, everyone would write a story. And then in high school, that stopped. Like as soon as a prof was like, "Oh, you have an option of either doing a paper or doing a creative project," it was about half and half. So there were some people who were like, fantastic, or like, I can do whatever I want for once. And then there was everyone else who was like, nah, we're gonna stick to what we know. So there's some things, and I guess somewhere in the early teens where for some reason that flips over, and so maybe that would be somewhere to concentrate on.
Yeah, I wondered a bit too with your art teacher, whether another kind of teacher could just, like, you can see it working in any discipline, right? Just say, I'm your guy, it's your path, go.
I would agree, but even in art, you had teachers who would write a book. I remember there was this one teacher who was saying, hey, I basically write, and then you have to follow what I'm doing to like get to it. So you always have those two different approaches, I guess, regardless of the field.
There's?
I see Daniel on his piece of paper has openness written down,
Yeah.
which probably is a personality trait that factors in heavily. And I think part of that is like how comfortable a person is with uncertainty, without feeling
The
being
students
lost.
or the professor?
The student.
And without feeling like a failure. Like, I bet that's what happened for real.
Yeah.
But
I
there's,
wonder the creative project, because maybe
but there's uncertainty and uncertainty.
Uncertainty and uncertainty.
Yeah, there's levels of uncertainty. Some of them are more threatening than others.
Yeah.
What's threatening uncertainty?
Sorry, to me again, it comes back to the thing that if you have no idea how to tackle an issue, it's a very threatening uncertainty. If you have an idea of how to start, then things get a bit more interesting with uncertainty.
Sorry, I will beat a dead horse. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I wonder, because I think like the openness and other personality traits are usually seen as like temperaments, so like from birth, you kind of have a certain propensity. But I wonder how much is just like creating associations early on between like, does uncertainty become rewarding because of like your early life experiences, or does it become threatening?
How does it become a reward?
How does it become rewarding?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I guess one thing would be like if you have like these opportunities for like unsupervised learning, and it is a safe environment, and you can like figure stuff out without like some kind of catastrophic failure. Maybe that could be a way of setting you up to like be more comfortable with uncertainty.
Because he's right, you can have absolutely no idea how to begin something, but get used to the fact that if you play around, you'll get an idea of the direction. And if you never get that, then the uncertainty will always be threatening. And so it is possible to even cultivate that, like to push the threshold of threatening pretty far back.
If you were to put me in a car garage and say, fix the car, again, I would just go into the corner and start crying. I mean, it's just too much. It's
If
just
you were
too much.
stuck in the middle of nowhere and you had to, you would tinker.
No, I would start walking. No, really, I'm very serious. A car's a good example. Your car breaks down in the middle of nowhere. I open the hood, like, really, I have no idea.
No, but she's saying you can push back that limit, I think, what I'm understanding is in the sense that if you
Slowly.
were to have a smaller car part to start
Right.
with, right? And you're uncertain, but there's only
Right.
so many things you can try, and you'll try them until you learn something, and then you build up from there, and piece by piece, although
Right.
you'll have never really been more familiar when the piece gets bigger, that same feeling of unfamiliarity will be somewhat stable as your abilities to deal with it and to solve the problem gets higher, until one day maybe you can be in that same garage and then feel that same amount of uncertainty you felt in front of the smaller part, but then be used to it and understand that, like,
I think there's.
Okay, wait. Elena wanted to say something for a long time.
Well, I guess it now relates to what we're talking about. I think some of the outright fear of the uncertainty comes from this expectation of a result. Like, you need to achieve a certain end point, and how are you going to get to that end point? But say if you didn't need to get somewhere, that fear wouldn't necessarily exist if from, like, I almost imagine if we could split education up so that when you're in your younger years, you don't need to be in the system where it's all about output like you get to in high school, and it becomes really stressful. Now it's not really about figuring things out, it's about getting the result that someone wants of you. And instead you get comfortable with the idea of, like, developing your own intuition, and it would be different for different kids, of course. Some kids are more comfortable by themselves without that much guidance than others. But if you are really aware that you have to get to the same place as everyone you're with at a young age, it becomes really stressful because you might not be one of those kids that can do that, and it might not be where your brain's leading you. But, like, in terms of pushing back the uncertainty threshold, if we were learning how to just, like, tinker with an idea that didn't need to be the same output as all the other kids, now you're figuring out how to learn as opposed to, or how to explore, and then perhaps you get to high school and now it's true, like, you need to learn real things. Like, you get to a job, you need to know, like, an actual theory of something or whatever it is you're understanding, but maybe you feel more freedom in how you approach the topic, or you feel less afraid of failing or doing it differently than other people because you realize that there's this part in between that is different for you from other people. Does that make sense?
I agree. I think my optimal learning environment would probably be one without grades. Because the whole time I was so focused on my grades because it was going to get me to where I needed to go. And it was mostly rote memorization. Whereas if I had the freedom to actually breathe and to learn things myself, I would have, like, perhaps more knowledge, more skills that would have been beneficial in my first years of university. So I think I know the grades are important, but
We can talk a long story about grades. I just want to put this in also as a matter of historical facts, like the reaching your level, minimum level, was actually a very social thing, right? So the idea was that everyone in society will reach a minimum floor which will allow them to not be exploited by others, right? So because wealthy, educated people, like people in this room, myself included, have always had a good education, right? But the idea is having minimal standards is that the government will force society to make sure that everyone, even the poorest, even the most abandoned person will reach a certain level which will allow him or her to be effective in society, right? So it wasn't meant necessarily it's not the only reason, but it wasn't meant necessarily to make you robots. It was also to make sure that things were spread out more equally than they had been. Right? If you look at what Quebec was, I'm sure you guys are not much aware of this, but in the 1960s, there's this very famous thing in Quebec called le rapport parent, right? So what were called French Canadians at that time, now we call Québécois, but they were called French Canadians. Their level of education was probably, it was probably at the level of a really, really poor third world country. They were behind on every measures, right? So the rapport parent said, we're going to do this, we're going to create the CEGEPs, we're going to have standards, we're going to have spread education minimally, forcefully to everyone to make sure society grows too. So it's not always, it wasn't necessarily meant to be negative all the time. I just want to put that here. It is important, and when you talk to people around Quebec, it's like when they say we have minimal standards and you have to pass the exam, just they want to make sure that no one is left behind. You don't do 12 years of schooling and barely know how to read, which could be the case, right? But the idea behind it is that we ensure that by the time you spend all this time in school, you get to a place where we all think is minimal to be able to succeed in society. Sorry to have to say this, but I think it's important to realize this.
I think I agree that having that standard minimal level is important across the country or across all socioeconomic statuses. What I found fault when I was a student though is that we were never explained why we had to learn that specific topic, and that to me created such a barrier because I reverse psychology works a bit too well on me, so I think I don't know I might be unique on this, but if I
everyone
see
has a mental note of this.
if I see an ad,
I'll never bring food to B25. Never bake for us.
right.
I'm gonna do it even harder now. But if I asked a teacher that why do we have to learn this? Why do we have to learn this specific topic? It was usually once again pertaining to math, but or physics or chemistry. I got because you have to, which was but why? So I think that standardized thing is important. But it's also important to explain to kids why they are learning, not just because so that everyone learns equally. That's not the thing, because that's the standard, but the specific topic.
Right.
Exactly.
You're right. So wait. Tell us your name again.
Polly.
Polly?
Yeah.
So let's break the ice. Once you speak once, you'll be able to speak again. So what do you think of all this? So what would be a good, if you're 20 years from now, you have a 13-year-old kid, and you want your kid to have a beautiful learning environment, what would it be like? A beautiful learning moment, what it would be like?
I think I agree with a lot of the things that have been said. I think explorative learning is really good to encourage, but I also think there is quite an individual sense to how people want to learn, and maybe having more power put in the hands of the learner would be a way to kind of appeal to that, because I think like you were saying, our educational system developed for a reason, and that reason is still relevant today. We still don't want people to be subject to we want them not to be ignorant so that they can't be taken advantage of, but now in our modern society we have so much more knowledge of how we learn and how we are as individuals different from one another, so maybe using that to make learning more individualized and put the power in the hands of the learner would be something. I don't know how we would go about doing that necessarily, but it's really interesting to
That's okay, we're blue skying right now. So Michael and then Elena?
I just wanted to respond to your point in being explained as a child why something might be important, but I don't think I would have trusted myself as a child if I asked why is this important and received an answer that I would have bought into that and then decided that that was a good thing for me to pursue. In fact, it might have had the opposite effect. I might have thought it was a poor answer, why should I devote energy to this, and I would actually recede. I would just kind of disappear, I just wouldn't be present in class, go through the motions, etc. And so I think being told because it's important isn't being told you have to do this, it's you're not ready to understand why this is important yet, and we're going to delay the answer until you're ready. But for now, you also need to learn so you can build on that learning, and then once you have the tools, you can understand why it's important, because you can actually do something with what you've collected. But I think it's a lot to ask a child who doesn't even know what you could do with math, for example, that in the future you will be able to do something with this. Yeah.
But then,
Wait, you wanna adjust on this?
oh, sorry, yeah, just,
Okay.
but then I think it's important to say it in those words and not just say because you have to, because, especially with a lot of grammatical things I remember that we learned. In elementary school, we were taught like, you can do this, you can't do this, never ever do this. And in high school, one of the first things my English teacher said was, all of your elementary school teachers lied to you. There are times when you can do this, it's just complicated and they weren't gonna tell a bunch of 10-year-olds that. And like, that makes sense, you know, why you don't go in as much depth before a kid is ready for it. But I think it's also fair to say like, listen, for now, don't worry about it, it'll come later. And then, you know, whether they trust you or not is a different thing, but like, to not, lie is a big word for it, but, you know, instead of saying, you can never ever do this, and then 10 years later you learn actually you can, it's just complicated, rather than say, for now, don't do this, that'll change when you're a bit older, but for now, don't.
I would say I received some of it, both sides, like, because you have to, but also, like, you will understand later.
Jill on this one, then we'll go to Elena.
It's Jerome Bruner, isn't it, who had all the work on readiness in children when he did his neuroscientific studies. So everybody is ready for things at a different age. And it made me think that maybe what we have to look out for the future is what we've learned about how our brains work and how we learn, and combine that with technology, because I mean, it's possible every little 13-year-old in the universe will have their own bot teaching them in 20 years from now. So I think we've got to bring in the technology side and the information we have about how people's brains work in different ways. That's all I wanted to say.
Elena?
I forgot what I was going to say on the point that was before. But when you were talking about empowering the learners, I don't really know all that much about it, but I know there are certain school systems in place, one of which being the Waldorf schools, that, you know, identify types of kids, which I'm sure has some weird roll-off effects in dividing kids, or maybe it's only the teacher that knows these things. But I do feel that some sort of focus on the fact that people are different, and of course categorizing always gets messy because everyone's different, so you can't, making groups is a very tricky thing, but I'm sure would very much so help forward this question of bringing people to the same place, but by way of the means that are actually necessary for them. Say if it's a kid that needs motivation or needs something to push them to, whether like some kids perhaps need an output requirement to make them do the middle, whereas some kids perhaps do not. And I wonder if there's a space for that, or if that would get very messy very quickly.
Okay, so that I think leads us to, because we also had a discussion on this yesterday, the answers were pretty similar. So it seems to, we all know what a great learning environment should be. It seems that we've all been through an education system that, you know, the ratio between the time you put into it and how much you get out of it is not great, right? I mean, if you think of the thousands of hours you've spent in that system, it's not a great return on how much you put into it. However, the correlation between the amount of time you spend in the schooling system and the quality of your life, the correlation is extraordinarily strong. So there's something that's working. So if we know all of these things, why can't we create such an environment? It's no secret, right? We know it. I mean, I think you would ask most people, most parents, they would say, I want, you know, here's journey, discovery. Part of it is self-discovery, part of it is mentorship, yes. I mean, we know these things, right? So why do we still have the education system that we have? So a couple of, so Viola, Chris, Danielle, and Nikia.
I think one of the big things is resources. Like, I can only really speak for the New York public school system, but which is already a pretty decent system, like on the whole, there's a lot of good schools. But even there's just not a lot of money that is given to schools to do things. And so, you know, if the school can only afford to have one teacher per 30 or even 40 kids in some cases, you can't have the like personal mentor or learning adapted to everyone. So in order to be able to do those things, you need a lot more time, a lot more energy, a lot more resources, which we could probably have if we figured out better ways to like manage budgets. But I think that's probably one of the big barriers.
I think if we'd have more money, we could just have more buildings.
Well, that's what I mean by figuring out the budget in a better way.
Good.
So I would challenge the initial statement. Do we actually know how exactly we get a good, able human in society through education? Because I would look at my own life course as reference, and I am who I am because I've had great teachers and appreciated them, but I've also survived bad teachers. And I don't know how much that second part really influences my ability to go through hardship. So that's why I'm not sure we actually know the perfect recipe, and so implementing, of course, something that we're not sure of is not very easy.
Okay, but let's just say, it's a very good point you're making, but what you're describing is more a good accident of the system more than an intent of the system, right? It's more like, oh, wow, this was great. Never intended for you to be able to survive hardship in your life because you had that teacher. It was just like we never thought of something else, right? So, to me, the intent would be also a question that, because I agree with you, but that's not the way we're thinking about it. Or building it, let's just call it that.
Right.
Daniel?
It's interesting, what am I trying to say? I don't think this answer is a cop-out, but I would love to see like what will naturally happen in a certain amount of time as like kind of a new generation of teachers gets phased in, because like this whole time I've been kind of thinking about the 3 Blue 1 Brown YouTube series, which kind of explains math concepts in a really good way. And I found that, you know, it's still very pedagogical and, you know, instructive. You know, it's not that they let the student really explore, you know, he's still going through something, but he's very, very good at generating like an emotional, like, you know, attachment to the math subject, like making it all seem very beautiful and stuff. And there's and so in a lot of cases, a very minimal amount of stuff that you have to change to generate a lot of, you know, success in your students, which is like the way that you instruct and present material. And I found that I got a lot of like, you know, pretty jaded or poor teachers that really made it or broke it for me. And from all the teachers that I've talked to, they say, I love to teach. I can't see myself doing anything else, but the way that they've set up the system for us is like at the end of 30 years, you just feel so beat up that like you don't really, you know, you can't find it within yourself to be a good teacher. So I think that a lot of it is really like, you know, empowering teachers, making sure that they're, you know, well paid, well fed, and so on.
What you say apply to every teacher, but not university.
Not
so
university.
we have full freedom. We're well paid, well treated. What you said, yes, applies to all of the other, right?
Sure.
But that thing doesn't apply to university professors.
So for adjuncts.
Well, even adjuncts, you do have freedom. You have freedom in the class. No, but you have freedom in the class, right? No one comes into your class. You don't have to follow a government path in arts.
In Canada, we're in good shape. In the States, it's another.
No, but in Canada, let's just say, compared to high school professors, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's also the case is a lot of them like have to teach like as a side gig to their research. So they're never taught to be teachers at all.
But then, okay, one question at a time.
Well, like I think all this to say.
This has changed humongously in the last 20 years, right? So graduate students get classes on how to teach, we train new professors. This, compared to when I was a student, it's a humongous difference. But it's slow, but it's good. So wait, so we have Nakia and then
I think I was just gonna say that you can try and build up an ideal education system, or you can try and do everything right when you're making that up, but then at the same time, I don't think you can separate that it still is a system within a bigger system, which is a society which in of itself is biased and is flawed, and that's gonna show up in any subsystem that you try and build. So, like, if you just, this is maybe not the best example, but if you look at like AI or something, you can try and make something that is very fair, that like you can try and program something that you think, okay, this is wonderful, but if your data is biased to begin with, that's going to influence it. And I think the same way looking at education as a system within our society, and you're always, there's inequality, there's discrimination, there's so many different factors that are still inherently, there's classism, that are just inherently part of the bigger system of society. So whatever you try and do within it, no matter how perfect, you try and make the education system that's still going to filter through. And I think that's important.
Yeah, no, I like that point a lot, because I guess if we're speaking now on slightly less idealistic terms of just what is here now, especially in the university, despite maybe more freedoms in teaching, I think a lot of people feel the bigger system, which is the economic woes and the necessity for a job, and this then systemization of what you're learning here, and it doesn't become about the learning, it becomes about the output, that is the grade, that is then transformed in theory, as we're told, into the job, into the life. And that really, I think, plays such a big role in the university context. Because honestly, I have a lot of friends that are in much more stressful positions than myself, and the university experience becomes about something else, which is doing as best as you possibly can in the system of measurement to help yourself on the other side. And the system of measurement, I think, is what makes it really stressful within the classroom, and for the teacher for that matter, I think, in that you now have to find a way to measure what you're teaching, and then you kind of shift focus on what's happening in the classroom a little bit, where yes, you're teaching, but you also have to measure the teaching.
But where those who've heard me before on these things, where I agree partly with both of you, where I don't agree is that we're not just sheep that you're bringing to the slaughterhouse. We actually create those systems too ourselves, right? So if there's a system that really doesn't work, we usually try to push back against it. We push back very little against education overall. Whether it's politics, ministries, society, we say, oh, we need more graduates, we need our students to learn. What you read everywhere is like, well, teachers are not good enough, they're not performing enough. We push very little against that system. So my question to you, as a sort of a self-reflection, is what do we gain from that system? Because we're keeping it. So obviously, we're gaining something out of it, right? There's something that's positive about that we like about that system. I can just throw an idea, for example, as a professor, it's easier in a way to teach a curriculum. For me, it's easier to teach French language and grammar than French literature. Because boom, matter, it's just like even this, it's done. The other one, I have to be creative and think, and sometimes you fall flat on your face when you do this, and students are unhappy, and the tension in the classroom, and it is difficult. The journey of discovery sounds great, but some students, you start the journey and they fall flat on their face and they broke their ankle right away. And they're like, oh crap, right? So just think about what are we getting out of this system that we like? Isabelle and then Isabelle?
I think that maybe what we're getting out of the system is a bit harder for us to understand, like for the reason that you mentioned earlier, that we're like a pretty small sample of people with a very specific opinion on what school is and what it should be, and especially on what it could be, because we're kind of here, I think, to make the most out of it, to really squeeze out of it kind of as much as we can, and to kind of like come out of it with like a success, according to all of these measurements and everything. But I think that if we really want to see why we're keeping the system, we have to look at maybe how the majority of people are living it, and we can even go back to like thinking about it from the perspective of the 13-year-old. A lot of 13-year-olds, like I would think the majority, are really not like us. They're not the driven, top of the class type people that go to school because they want a perfect education that's creative and structured. And most kids, like, they just go to school because that's where their friends are. And that's why we're keeping, I think, the system on many different levels. It's just because it's a hub where you can be with people, doing something that's somehow stimulating. And although a lot of kids, like, they think that they hate school, they stay home on a sick day for like 3 days, they're bored. They want to go back, they want to be with their friends again, they want to see their teacher, because like that's just where everyone is and that's what they're doing. And what else would they be doing if there wasn't school? It's kind of like one of those things where it's like, maybe it doesn't serve us as well as it could, but it certainly serves us pretty damn well, keeping all 16-year-olds like off the streets and like busy and like connecting them with like, again, drama club or like a sports group. And you know, we think of learning like in a very like specific way. You were mentioning, and I agree with a lot of what you were saying about math, for example, where you know, it'd be great to have more creativity and more individuality, which is like true that it could be interesting, but you know, math class and education as a whole, I think like it just fits into such a huge system of learning, just like this bath of like learning in day-to-day life, and most of it is unstructured. Most of it is you're learning social skills by going to the mall with your friends or learning how to play soccer after school. Like the math class, the supervised learning is such a tiny part of that huge like learning situation in which you learn about yourself and about how to be a social being and how to just even just going to math. Like for me, for the longest time, I don't like math. I'm one of those kids. I'm like, it doesn't fit with me. I'm sorry. But what I do tell myself,
nobody's perfect.
What I do tell myself when I go to math classes, I'm learning how to concentrate and to focus on doing something that I don't like, which is true. Like it's a skill in itself, and it's a skill that you're learning as well. That's like super valuable in society. And so I think that although there's so much room for improvement, we also do have to. Then again, it's just my opinion, but like acknowledge that the education system as it is, you're right, like it is serving us really well. It is serving that purpose of just giving us something to do, a routine, a place where we can connect and anticipate that we'll connect. You know, we go to school knowing that our friends will be there because they also have class and they're also following this like this script that we have for ourselves in our youth, because we're kind of like not that useful yet to society. Like we can't quite hold down a job that's like high up, and this is kind of going all over the place, but as much as like math, it would be fun that everyone would like it. I think that it wouldn't serve us that well to have a math class that pleased everyone, for everyone to become a mathematician, and that for us to all, you know, be like avid mathematicians. I think it's just like good to have that kind of variability and to really acknowledge the power that we have in what we do with school, because we are all kind of on the same trajectory, but when you look at people coming out of it, there's such a broad range. A lot of people are like, yeah, I rocked it with my B-, and like I loved it, played sports, had a great time, learned a couple things, and now I'm doing my job, and they look back to it as something that was good, and they probably don't see that much improvements that should be made because they overall didn't give themselves such a high expectation, didn't really abide by all of these like super strict measures that we like put ourselves through, and they just kind of had a good time. It's like, I think that's kind of why we're still sticking with the system as it is, that generally speaking, there's not that much pushback against it. It does serve the purpose that, maybe not the purpose that we give it, but certainly a useful purpose that maybe what we should be telling our 13-year-olds is like, just go to school, just like hang out with your friends. Like that's what math class is too. It's like, oh, I'll sit next to Joe, like, you know, I wonder if he has a crush on me. Like that's what 13-year-olds are doing in math class. They're not actually thinking like, how could I like be more creative or like more structured in my, like they're not there at all. So that's just like my.
Thank you. That's really interesting, different point of view. Thank you. Giselle?
I think one of the main reasons that we don't change the system is that like it doesn't also have to, we don't have to change that it's a social hub, we don't have to change that like you have to sit through something that you don't like we can still keep and like retain the parts that serve us while also making it better for the people in it. But I think the main reason why we don't do that is that students are not taken seriously. And once they're out of the education system, once they become adults, they don't care because they're not in it. Like I know that there's always so much feedback from students on how to change, like how it can be made, like classes can be made better, the structure can be made better, but like you said, Olivia, there's like a hierarchy, especially in universities, and students are at the very bottom. So the system doesn't want to change because that's how it's been, that's how it's always been. Like it works well for them, and if it doesn't work well for the students, too bad. And then once the students are out of the system, they don't care because they're not in it. Or even if they do still care, there's still like, there's a very, very small minority left of them that on their own, it's a lot harder to like force that system to take a step back and see, okay, maybe this is not exactly ideal for everyone. Because the education system is supposed to be for the students too. It's not just for the society, it's not just for the people that are like the system, but its main purpose, in my opinion, should be for the students. And if you don't listen to the students, to a certain extent, because like students are sometimes like they're gonna have very unrealistic expectations of what habits should be like, that simply will not work. But as long as there's no conversation between the system, the people who perpetuate this, and the people who are at the best part to give feedback, along with the certain instructors, then like the system's not gonna change as much because there's no enough pushback, and like the pushback is coming from the plebeians, so you know. We don't
Okay, so as usual, you're very passionate. Let me give you an example. So just to reassure you, I think that in my experience with the education system at different levels is that people do actually care about students a lot. Do they think students are competent enough to get involved is a different question. They do care about students, but so let me give you an example. It's a current example, which hasn't changed much actually in the education system, but at UQAM, right, Université du Québec à Montréal, students actually vote on the syllabus. They can say, we don't like this, change that. So do you think that's a good idea? It does, nowadays, it was from the 60s, right? Nowadays, it's pretty much I'm sorry?
C'est genre formalité.
Yeah, it's a formality nowadays. But the principle is that, yep, no, I don't agree.
Is it a formality because
People
nobody
assume-
cares to use it anymore, or because it's changed the way professors make their syllabi?
No, I think it's because because it's a different political environment than it was in the 60s. Chris?
I can't speak to all the institutions here, but I followed a bit what happens in the States, and I can tell you that the students have a lot of power in the state schools. They can get teachers fired, they can go up against the establishment and really rally up against the cause that they believe in. And so I think a lot of what we're trying to do has to be a balance, because in some institutions they try to give powers to the students and it backfires, and others, yeah, of course, students will have a voice, but that balance is really hard to find.
Yeah, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. Right?
Yeah.
Let's stick a bit with the content because it's less explosive, right?
Exactly.
And
No,
it's
it's
more
good, it's
difficult the balance, right? But if we stick with content, because we're talking about content mostly, so Christian and Paul, yes, Paul. Sorry.
Because we've been talking a lot about, you know, like the best method to have someone learn and stuff like that, like or doing more practical,
Right.
all that. But I think Isabel like pointed out something very important, is that often students, like, they're just not motivated to learn.
Why is that?
I'm not sure, but I'd like to share like a personal anecdote. Like, my dad's a really smart guy. Like, I have a great relationship with him and all, and he's might even like probably smarter than me in many levels and all. But during COVID, I was doing my studies in physics, and he has no background in sciences at all. And so I was like, oh, like it makes me sad that I can't talk to you about what I'm learning, you know, because we've always like talked a lot about, you know, what's going on in life. So I said, well, you know what, I'll teach you, like I'll have one class every week, and I'll teach you like about from the ground up, like physics and math and all that. And like he was acting such a child, like when I was teaching, and like it was like he was like, you know, like when a kid, like you go like, so is the answer this or that, and he just like tries to like just, he doesn't understand anything, he just goes like, this one, no, the other one. And it's like super like, and so it actually lasted for a while. I think he learned some stuff, but like the bottom line was that like he was just not interested in the material. He had the full like, you know, capacities and like the even and I'd like to believe he had a good teacher, you know, and like but
one-on-one instruction, all the things that we think are missing.
Exactly, but like he was not interested. Yeah.
Do you know that it was like lack of interest, or was it like insecurity?
Oh, that's a good point, actually.
Because I feel like it can genuinely be either.
Yes.
I think there was a bit of insecurity because like he's also like very control freak. So when he's out of his comfort zone, and you're like, and it's like he doesn't like to fail, so like he doesn't try, so he doesn't fail, kind of thing. But there's also the fact that he doesn't care that much about the subject. So
I tried the same thing with my parents.
And
I
on
tried,
what?
I tried to tell them about, like, I wanted to tell them about my research because I want them to understand what I'm doing, so, and they have a hard time. And so I try to make it relatable to their interests. So with my mom, she's very open to learning, but if I make it towards her interest in art. So if I can explain philosophical concepts in terms of art. But with my dad, he completely shuts down because he sees it as, he's intimidated and he's embarrassed. And I can't teach him anything. And if I do, it has to be very subtly. Like, oh, did you know I read this article the other day in the newspaper? They were talking about this. And then that's how he learns.
Get them that they're not expecting.
So we have Polly and Kia.
This is kind of on a different track, but it relates to what you were saying about like how everybody is super different, like in terms of how they like approach school. And like I was just thinking as you were speaking about how like I think in 20 years, like I would want my kids going into a school system to just have as much opportunity as possible. Like whether that's to like do extracurriculars that they're interested in, or whether that's to like take a more creative approach to the math classes that they love. Like I feel like school, like as long as it's giving you the opportunity to like do what you want to do, whether that's socializing, academics, like extracurriculars, that is like the essence of a good school. Kind of.
Kia, and then we'll have one last one.
I think this was kind of to what Christian had said, and I think maybe why I don't have motivation and stuff, and this is just speaking from my own experience, but like my parents, they both went to university and everything, but growing up, they really didn't care too much about the school system. Like they never looked at my grades, they never like, and for like my mom especially, like she went through like the British system where she did A-levels and all of that. For her, she just felt like if you're actually learning something, it wasn't going to be from school. And that's very much the kind of mindset that she kind of had, was where growing up and like in the workforce and stuff, she was like, okay, all these people who did well in school, they don't know how to do this, or they don't know how to talk to people, how to do things that she felt were a lot more important. And so I think there is also part of that's what's missing, is you don't have that direct translation between, I think it kind of means this kind of idea that, oh, if you do well in school, that translates into doing well in life or having a good life, and there is that divide, and this is again, like I very much grew up with parents who felt that way, who, like, if there was anything worth learning, my mom didn't think I was going to learn it from school, and I think that's maybe a different perspective as well, as there is that divide.
Okay, it's been 2:30. We need half an hour before lightning. I'm here behind you. Yeah.
Half an hour standing up.
So a couple of things before you leave. Just remember what we keep saying here. There are no simple solutions to complex problems. So complex solutions to complex problems. Education is a complex institution, right? So a bit like health and all of these things. I have homework for you, because I think our next QA is in 2-3 weeks or a month or something. I'd love for the next QA to be on what would be a beautiful teaching experience. Yeah, we never talk about the other side of it, right? So if you can ask a professor of yours that you like, that you're comfortable with, is like, what would be a beautiful teaching moment you've had in your life and your life? What would that person see as a beautiful teaching environment, right? I don't want to do it now,
Okay,
so we don't have much time, but what was a beautiful teaching moment, and what would they see as a beautiful teaching environment for them too, right? Starting from the point of view, which I think is mine at least, is that, and I think most of us share this, is that the great majority of your professors want to have a great teaching environment the way you have to have a great learning environment, right? And the last one is a conundrum for all of you. You don't have to answer the question. So 20 years from now, or 15, 20 years from now, you have a 12-year-old or 13-year-old.
It's alarming.
Yeah.
I have like 40 years before I have a kid.
Well, you know.
All right.
You're not 12. Anyway, some years from now, some years from now, you have a 12 or 13-year-old, they're going into a secondaire or middle school, I guess, in the States, well, when you're 12 to 13. Okay. You have a choice between a difficult public school or an expensive, extraordinarily good, engaging private school.
What do you mean by difficult public school?
unfunded,
Okay.
a bit, you know, violent, you know, but it's not where, you know, the engagement, as you said, Polly, you know, all the opportunities, they're not as present. The kids are coming from families for whom this is difficult. There's less motivation. The professors are, you know, doing disciplines more than anything else. Between this, which is public, which is, and your kid is good, your kid is brilliant, your kid is on top of the school, you send them to public school or to private school where they have more opportunities. So public is your kid or society, because it's important for public school to have brilliant kids too. The other one is your kid on top of society. You say, screw society, I want my kid to have the best education possible. Which is the conundrum that most parents are facing. Which has an impact on everything, like McGill. Right, so think about these things. It's one thing to be in the abstract, it's another thing to be in the concrete when you're faced with these things. And even though the difference is not as big in Quebec and Canada as it is in the States, for example, it still exists. It's still there. All right, thanks, that was fun. Thank you very much, everyone.